Ladies and gentlemen, designers and developers, welcome back to the third video in our Wized beginner tutorial series. In this video, we are going to finally get started with Wized. We are going to create a new Webflow project, a new Wized project, link the two together, and then explore some of the basics of Wized, elements, events, and variables. So let's jump into it. We first need to create a Webflow site. That is our starting point here, or we can use an existing one. To create a Wized project, we have to have a Webflow site ready to link it to. So we need to set that up first. We can then create our Wized project and link it using the subdomain of our Webflow site. We will then add the Wized embed script to the Webflow site. That's the JavaScript code that links Wized to our Webflow site so that all the logic that we set up happens on the site. And then we're going to dive into the Wized Configurator, which is the Wized application where you set up all of your logic. So over in my Webflow account, I'm going to go ahead and create a new site. We can go with a blank site. I'm going to call this Wized Intro Tutorial. And I am going to just do some very simple layout here. So I'm going to add in a section. I'm going to add in a container. I'm going to pop a heading in here and call it Intro to Wized Tutorial. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and publish this so that Wized can pick it up. There's our site. Okay, over to Wized. So we can create workspaces in Wized. These are kind of like folders in Webflow, but you can share access to them. So if you were creating a project for a client or you need to work on it with particular people, add them as collaborators, you do that through a workspace. So I have one down here called Wized Tutorials. I can add collaborators to this so that they can access the Wized projects. I can delete it and I can rename it. So I'm going to go in there and I'm going to click New Project. So the first thing we need to do is pop in our staging domain. So I'm going to go back over to my site and I'm going to copy the tutorial, the link, which isn't visible on the screen, but I'm sure you know how to get that and copy it. Then it's going to provide us with the embed code. So what this is a JavaScript script that we're going to paste into the head section of our site. Now, typically you would do this on all pages. So you would go into the settings of your Webflow site and into custom code and paste it into the head. You can do this on a page by page basis. And the main reason you would do that is part of the pricing tier for Wized involves the number of page views. So for example, we have a client that gets a lot of traffic to their site, but they only need to use Wized on one page. So in that instance, they went into their page settings and they put the embed code in there. For this tutorial, we're going to put it in here. This is typically where it's going to go. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it in here. What does this do? As you work on your Wized project, it is going to create JavaScript in the backend behind the scenes. And what this code is going to do is it's going to pull all of the code from your Wized project and execute it. It's going to run it on the page. So if you build out a web application using Webflow and Wized and you remove this code, Wized is not going to work. It is not going to be linked to your website. So we put it in here, typically at the top so that it's the first thing that loads, and we can click save. We'll then have to publish our site for that to take effect. So back over on Wized, I'm going to give this project a name. I'm going to call it Intro to Wized Tutorial, and I can change the workspace down here if I wanted to, but I am happy to keep it there. And I'm going to click Create Project. And it seems Wized is not picking up the code. So we can go into publishing, and it seems to think that I have set the site to private, which is a possibility. So there's another tip for you if that pops up. Into site settings, into publishing, and turn off make staging private. I think maybe our workspace has that on by default. So let's publish that again and create our project. There we go. Welcome to the Wized Configurator. This is where you're going to be doing all of your work creating logic for your Webflow and Wized web application. So let's take a quick tour around the UI. We have our bar here at the top, which I'm going to refer to as the top bar. We have our left side panel, which is closed at the minute. If we click into any of these, it's going to open it. This is typically where you first go into a different or particular section of Wized. We're going to go through what those are. And depending on what you select over here, on the right-hand sidebar, you're going to get your controls or your specific action settings, events that you want to set up. Very similar to how Webflow works. So we'll start with the top bar. We can click the Wized logo to go back to the overall page where you can view your projects and your workspace. Next up, we have a list of pages that are on the website. So you can navigate between them by using this. If you have any links directly in your pages, they will also work. Canvas is something we're going to look at a different time. It allows us to set parameters in the URL of our page. We'll cover those later. And the refresh button is going to refresh the canvas. So if you make an update in Webflow, or if you make updates in Wized and you want to reload the page to get those working, you can click that up here. Sometimes you will have events or requests that happen when the page loads, so you can use this button to test that. And you can also rescan for attributes, which we'll cover shortly. We then have X-ray. So this is a very important button, and it's going to be our introduction into Wized attributes. So to manipulate elements from our Webflow site inside of Wized, we have to give it a custom attribute. So I'm going to go back over here to my site, and I'm going to open the site in the designer, and I'm going to add some elements on the page. And what we're going to do is, in more depth, we're going to build what we covered in the previous video, which is a text element with a number that increments or goes up every time a button is clicked. So I'm going to put a paragraph in here, and I'm going to put it in as 0. And I'm going to call this counter number, and I want to make that nice and big, even bigger, and I want to bold it. And I'm going to add in another one, and I'm going to call it clicks so far. Okay, and then I'm going to throw in a button down here, and I'm going to put the text in as add a click. Nice and straightforward, doesn't need to look amazing. So we need to think about what elements we need to manipulate or control inside of Wized. What I want to do is have this increment every time the button is clicked. I don't need this heading to change. I don't need it to be clickable. I don't need any logic to manipulate it. And the same for this text down here. So these do not need attributes. These do, the counter number and the button. We need to add logic to them. So what we'll do is we'll click our counter number, and on the right-hand panel, we'll go over to settings where we have custom attributes. Attributes are used to add additional information to an element that doesn't affect the styling or the structure of the page. And it is most commonly used to target that element using JavaScript. So if you've ever used any of FinSuite's attribute solutions, you'll be familiar with attributes and how those are used by those solutions to add extra functionality. For Wized, all of our attributes have to have the name Wized, and we can then define whatever value we want. So I'm going to call it Wized. And for the value, we have a page on our Wized documentation site that has some guidance on how to name these. But you want to give it a name that makes sense to you, that you're going to recognize. So what I typically do is I start with what the overall goal or aim of a particular function is. Then what it is it text, is it a button, and what it does. So I'm going to call this counter text. Okay, and I'm going to go to my button and do the same. I'm going to add a custom attribute. I'm going to call it Wized, and I'm going to call it counter, because that's what the overall functionality is here. And in case I have any buttons later on, I'm going to say increment. So this is for our counter functionality. This particular element is a button, and what it does is increments. And I will click out of that to have that there. So I'm going to go ahead and publish again. And once that's done, over in Wized, I am going to refresh the canvas. That's going to pull in all of the changes that I made. And now we're going to go back to X-ray and turn it on. What this does is highlights all of the Wized attributes that are on your canvas. So this is very useful for seeing what's set up on the page, and also for navigating to these and giving them settings. So 2 ways we can control these. First is turning on X-ray and clicking on the element. That is going to open up this side panel where we have our settings for the elements and we have our element events. If I turn off the X-ray, I can also go over here to the left-hand panel. So what we have here are apps and requests to start off. Apps are external services that we want to connect to, and requests are where we work with those apps to either send or receive data from our web application. We're going to look at those in more detail in the next video. Up next, we have events. This is where you add your if-else logic. So let's say I wanted to have something happen when the page first starts loading. Maybe I want to have a welcome message appear and then disappear. I can do that in here. Elements are going to show us all of the elements in our web app, in our Wiz project, as well as the ones that are currently on this page. So if I hover over these, it's going to turn on X-ray mode, but it's only going to show me that element, like so. And I can access them by clicking here, and that's going to open up the panel on the right. Next up, we have the data store. And this is going to hold all of the data or information that's inside of our project. We have variables, navigation, cookies, secrets, input fields, and forms. So for this mini project, we are just going to be using variables. So variables allow us to store and to calculate information. For example, if you had a multi-step form that you built in Wized, you might have a variable called form step, and you would have a next button with some logic that says when this is clicked, increment the form step by 1, and then your different sections of the multi-step form are going to have logic that says for step 1, show it if the variable is 1, for step 2, show it if the variable is step 2. So we can go in here and create a variable, and that's going to open this panel over on the right hand side. We give it a name. Again, we want to do something that makes sense, and with attributes, with variables, we always give these a underscore in between. So you'll see for these attributes, they are lowercase and they have underscores. Don't use spaces, don't use hyphens or the minus sign, go for underscores. So I am going to call this counter. Nice and simple. Next, I can give it an initial value. So that's the value that it's going to start off on. And by opening this up, we are going to get our first introduction to the function editor. The function editor is where we write JavaScript to make things happen, to have logic in our application. So we'll typically do some sort of logic followed by a return statement. So you might think, if you're new to this, that you can just type in 0. And you can test your function by going up here and clicking this test function or run function, and it's going to come back with null. So an important point about the function editor. We have to return a value from the function editor. So once we write our logic, which is inside here, the JS code, we need to return it. So what we have here is we have a variable inside our variable called a, and that is equal to 3. And then we have b is equal to 5. To get that math out, to get this to return the number 8 so that we can use it in our web application, we have to say return followed by what we want to return. So in this case, it's going to return 8. Let's do that over here. Let's say a equals 3. And then we can finish this with a semicolon. We don't have to use these in JavaScript, but it's good practice to use them. We will say b equals 5. And we will say return a plus b. So we can do math inside of the function editor. Now if I click test function, it is going to return 8. If I just say a plus b, it is not going to do anything. I have to put in this return statement, and then I will get the value that I'm looking for. So all we want to do here is we want to say return 0. And we want to run it, and we're getting 0. Bingo. We can close out of this window, which we can also move around and resize as needed. So I will X out of that. The next option is persist in storage. And what this is going to do is it's going to store the value of this variable on the user's browser. If we go for session storage, when the user closes the tab or window and comes back to it, this will be reset back to 0. If we go for local storage, it's going to store it more long-term in the user's browser. But if they clear their cookies and their data for the site, it is going to be deleted. So this is not used for storing information that needs to be robust or that needs to be permanent. What we do use this for are use cases where we need to temporarily store a value. So for this purpose, tracking the number of clicks, that's going to work fine. Another example, to go back to the multi-step form, if when the user comes back, we want to send them back to the form, to step 1, we wouldn't make this persist in storage. So if they get to step 3 out of 5 and they refresh the page, it's going to go back to step 0 or step 1, whatever we set as the initial value. If we get it to persist in local storage, now we have some memory in our application. If the user gets to step 3 out of 5 and refreshes the page, they're going to still be on step 3 when they come back. And computed lets us change the value of the variable. It lets us update it when other things happen in our application. We're going to look at that later on. So back over on the left-hand panel, we now have our counter variable. And it says null at the moment. If we refresh the page, it is going to say 0. So far, so good. Now we need to set up our button. So I'm going to go over to Elements, and I'm going to click Counter Button Increment. That's going to give us our settings and our events. We have a couple of options in settings. We can control the visibility of it, so we can put some logic in here in our function editor. We don't want to hide it in this case, but if we did want to control whether or not it's shown, depending on certain things happening in the application, we can do that there. We can also set the text of the element. Lists are for rendering out lists of information, kind of like your CMS collection list in Webflow. We'll look at that at a later date. And we have some more options down here that we'll look at later on. So we don't need to manage the visibility of this element. We don't need to change the text. We need to set up an event. So we don't have any events at the minute. So we're going to click Add Event. An event is something that happens on the page, an action that the user takes. Now, there are many different types of events in the web world. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is the most commonly used list of events. So you can type in other ones in here, or you can use these frequently used values. We just want a simple click. When this event happens, we want to trigger an action. So we have some other options here. Prevent default will prevent whatever the default action is inside of Webflow. So if there is a link on this element, we can disable it by turning on prevent default. For forms, that's where this is commonly used. If you have a form and you want to submit information to a database like Airtable, we would tick this to prevent the default action, which is a Webflow form submission. Over in Webflow, I have set up a link to go to the BBC website. And if we turn on prevent default and click this button, nothing's going to happen. If we turn it off and refresh our canvas and click it, now the default action happens. So I'm going to go back here and just remove that. Don't need it. Republish the site. And back over on Wized, we also have an option for conditional. That lets us add logic that says, if the following is true, go ahead with this click event. If it's not true, don't go ahead. So as an example, if we were submitting a custom form that we had built and the user needs to take a specific action or enter a particular value, let's say it's a quiz and they need to get the answer right to proceed, and clicking the button is how you proceed. We would add logic in here that says, if the answer is correct, return true, which means it can go ahead. If the answer is not correct, return false, and the click event is not going to work. So let's add our action. We have a couple of options in here. Perform request is used to trigger a request to get information from an external source or to send it to an external source. Set cookies lets us set the value of a cookie. We'll look at cookies later on. Set variable is what we want. And navigate to lets you send the user to a particular page or location. Run function we'll look at in more depth later on. So let's go for set variable. We are going to be asked to either create a new variable or select an existing one. So let's go ahead and select our counter variable. Then we get to set the value. So we are back in our function editor. What we want to do here is we want to set it to whatever its current value is plus 1. So first of all, we want to return this. We need to return this information to Wized so that it knows what we want to do. So we're going to say return, and then we need to enter our variable. Two ways to do this. The first is we can type it and view the autocomplete. To do that, we first need to know what we want to access. And that is represented by all of these little symbols up here. We'll look at what all of those mean, but V is for variables. So if we type V dot, we will get a list of our variables. We only have one. It is counter. That's the first way to do it. The second is to go up here and access the data store. So we saw this previously over here on the left. This is a way to access it inside our function editor. Again, we have these other items that we'll look at later on: cookies, forms, inputs, navigations, requests, and variables, which we can see we have one of. So we can click into this, and here we have our counter variable, and we can click to add that in like so. Similar to the function editor, the data store is resizable and movable. We'll just click out of it for now. So next step, we need to increment this by 1. So there are two ways we can increment or increase this variable by 1. The first is to type in v.counter plus 1. So if it starts at 0 and this runs, it's going to go up to 1. If we run it again, it's already at 1. It's going to add on 1 again, and it's going to increment to 2. The other way we can do this is with a shorthand in front of the variable plus plus. That is going to add 1 to whatever the variable currently is. And if we click it alongside our test function on the right, we can see the number incrementing. So we'll close out, and we are going to reload the canvas and test this. So I haven't linked it up to this text yet, but we can test this in real time by having the data store open, keeping an eye on this counter variable, and clicking the button, and up it goes. If I reload the page, it is going to set back to 0. We didn't add that local storage to our variable. So we can click this, We can go over to the right to persistent storage, and we can say local storage. Now, if I refresh the canvas and increment this up to 5 and refresh it again, it is going to stay at 5. Before we change this text, let's double back and look at conditions. So if I go to Elements and click on my button, and on the right-hand side, go over to the Events panel, we can go down to Conditional and turn this on. Now, usually you would have some more advanced logic than just saying true or false, but for the purposes of demonstration, I am going to say return false. So in a future video, we're going to look at these different data types in JavaScript. We have numbers, strings, variables. True and false are called Booleans. They can only be true or false, yes or no, 1 or 0 also works for true and false. This is sometimes a useful way of temporarily disabling an action that you don't want to use. So if I wanted to do that, I could close out of here, I can reload, and now if I go to the data store and look at my variable, it is not going to increment. If I go back to this condition and change it to true and close out and refresh the page, now it goes back to working as desired. So the final step, we are going to link up this number at the top. We are going to go into our Elements panel and we're going to click our counter text. Over on the right, we once again have our element settings and our element actions. In this case, we don't need an action. All we need to do is go down to text. We have 3 different ways we can display the text. We have plain text, which is just simple text. HTML is for if you want to use HTML in there. We'll look at that another time. Markdown is another way of formatting text. We want to go with plain text and then set the value. So we click in here and it opens up our function editor. Now recall that we cannot just type v.counter. That's not going to work. If we click test function, we're going to get null. We have to return it. So we'll go back to the start here. We'll say return, and to keep the code nice and tidy, we'll add our semicolon at the end. Now it is going to return the number that we want. And if we X out of this and reload the canvas, there is our number. So, nice straightforward introduction to some of the tools that we have in Wized. Let's finish this out by looking at some of the other areas of the configurator. Up here, we have a simple undo and redo. So that's going to bring me back to my function editor. If I keep going through it, it's going to undo the work that I did. Let's put that back in. Like so. Close out. Up here, we have the option to manually save. I never click this because every time we make a change, so let's just change that to return, just to see that up here at the top, basically every time we change something in Wized, it's going to save automatically. So generally, you don't have to click that. You can let it do its thing. Preview, similar to Webflow, is going to open up your Webflow staging link. But if I try doing anything here, it's not going to work because back over in Wized, we first have to publish these changes. So that embed script that we looked at earlier, we need to send the code from our Wized configurator to that embed script so that that change is live. We do that by going up to publish. We can tick or untick our staging domain. We can also click here to link out to it. It will tell us when we last published. Similar to Webflow, if you pay for a paid plan and add a custom domain, you can control if you are pushing your changes to your staging domain or your live domain. So this works in sync with the staging and production publishing that is inside of Webflow. So I'm going to publish. And again, similar to Webflow, it'll tell me when it's done. And if I go over to my live staging URL and refresh, now it is going to work. And if I reload the page, it's going to be back at 10. Lovely. So that is the top bar. Some other items we have over here. The debugger is going to show us any problems or issues that it detects in our project. Logs are going to show us any events that are triggering on our page. So if I had a couple of requests that were pulling in data from Airtable and I wanted to inspect them, see are they running correctly, I can do that in the logs. So that becomes very handy as your project grows. We have some settings down here, the name of our project, the payment plan that we're on. The branding for the Wized logo down in the bottom right can be turned on or off with a paid plan, similar to Webflow. Domain is where we enter our staging domain and our live custom domain if we had one. If for some reason you need to change the staging domain of your Webflow site, make sure that you come in here and update this. The embed code can always be accessed from in here. If you delete it for some reason, you can copy it from here. There are also backups taken that you can restore. Share project allows you to enable a read-only link. So similar to with Webflow, you can turn that on. You can share it with someone. They will be able to see everything that you have set up, but they won't be able to make any changes. It is read-only. Clone project allows for your project to be cloned. So as we continue this tutorial series, there will be clonable Wiz projects to let you follow along. Export project is an advanced feature for downloading the JavaScript that is created by Wized. And the danger zone is for deleting your project. So be careful in that one. Over here, we have the support chat. If you are stuck with something, if you break something, if you have questions about your subscription, anything like that, you can use our support chat. We have a link out to our docs, which are very useful. We have a search feature that you can use to search for commands and to search for elements on the page. So I can see my elements here denoted by the square brackets and my variable. So I can close out of that. And we finally have a link to a series of video tutorials. These were designed to introduce people to the previous new version of Wized, and these will eventually be replaced by the video tutorial that you're now watching. So that is an overview of the Wized configurator. We looked at some of the items in the top bar, changing pages, reloading the canvas to bring in changes from Wized or Webflow, X-ray to view all the elements on our page, undo and redo, the saved status of our project, a preview link to the live staging URL, and our publishing options. On the left-hand panel, Elements gives us a list of our elements on the page, which we can hover over to see and click on to open up the settings. If there are settings applied, we will see the settings icon. If there are actions applied, we will see the actions icon. And the data store is where we access all of the data that our Wized application has access to. We looked at variables, how we give them a name, a value, and we can set if they persist in the user's storage. And the other data store options we'll be looking at in the future. We also looked at the right-hand panel for elements, where we can control the settings, which we'll be looking at in further detail, as well as the events that we can create to make things happen in our web app when the user takes an action. So that is all for today's video. Hopefully that gave you a good introduction to the Wized configurator and the basics of variables and elements. Do give us a like and a subscribe, and if you have any feedback or content that you'd like to see, you can leave a comment on the video, or you can head on over to our Discord channel, link in the description. Hope you had fun, learned a lot. Next up, we're going to be building an AI story generator and looking at apps and requests inside of Wized. See you there.